So we will call the Land Use Committee meeting to order on Tuesday, November 7th at 7:30 a.m. First item up is mixed-use pilot project ordinance. Mr. Bond.
Would you pass that to Ben?
Yeah.
This is a replacement ordinance.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Yeah, so Carrie has handed out a copy of the draft mixed-use pilot program ordinance that has some red line changes. Most of those changes came from the notes and review that Councilmember Diener had done on the proposal. There were two other corrections that were added based on some meetings that we've had and some internal staff review. One of those changes being a map change where we've created a fifth MUPP zone, and that is over along Perry and Bay Street. And this is the one part of the area that's being designated in the pilot program that has two relatively parallel streets at the same elevation, where one is lower and the other's higher, but they're fairly flat. And so in this area, we thought it would be prudent to measure from the uphill property elevation rather than from the average grade, which is being done in the other parts of the city. We realized that the designation we were applying to this was actually less than what's currently allowed in the view protection overlay, which uses that uphill elevation. And so the MUPP 5 is 15 feet above the uphill street grade, which would be the average grade of Perry along whatever property line would be redeveloped.
How far down does that go?
Mr. Smith's property is the last one included here. And then this is an existing 4-story apartment building next to him. You can go to, pull it up on the map here real quick.
That is so cool that you can do that.
Right? Oh, little Google man. Yeah, so this is out. This one is in.
Oh, okay.
And so anything beyond this is not included in the area. But the this is, I think, a gym is operating out of here now, and then this entire shopping center is included. And so 15 feet above the uphill grade is, it's going to preserve the views where those houses up above are about 10 feet above the street level.
The ones on Perry?
On Perry, correct. So this end doesn't allow as tall of a building as you would get if you go further down, where, as you can see, whoops. This one here is 4 stories and the roof is at grade with Perry, and then there's a garage off of Perry.
Oh, is that at grade with Perry?
Yeah, that rooftop is, so.
Okay.
But anyway, I guess I've jumped ahead a little bit. Did you have a question?
Well, I don't know how we're going to do the discussion.
Well, let me give you guys a little overview of sort of what we've been thinking with the ordinance. And essentially what, the mayor and I met on this a little while ago, and he's very eager to see some things happen downtown. And we talked about the different approaches that we could take to this. And I've been working on, post completing the Unified Development Code, I've been working on the actual zoning code updates to completely overhaul the zoning code, but that timeline is much longer than focusing on a small area. And he said, I really would like to see some things happen downtown. Is there something that we can do there? And I said, well, one thing we could consider doing would be, creating a set of regulations to deal with downtown now, and we could do it, as sort of a pilot program. And Tacoma, actually, where I live, just did a pilot program where they had an infill development pilot program where they started trying out all kinds of different approaches for infill development, and they established a quota system where they said, we're looking for 15 example projects of a detached ADU in different parts of Tacoma with one per neighborhood or something like that. And so I was studying that because I was possibly looking to use it in Tacoma at my own house, but and I started thinking about the approach of, we really need some demonstration projects in Port Orchard. We've allowed mixed-use development since, the late 90s or early 2000s by conditional use permit, yet we haven't had a single project develop. And so, and I've been able to identify some of the barriers to that development, but it's clear that our regulations combined with possibly just a lack of, proof of concept that there's a market for these type of units in Port Orchard are holding this thing back. And so we wanted to take the approach of, what if we allowed just a limited number of projects to show people what this could look like, and establish a limit to the number of units that would be allowed, and then if there was enough demand for the program, make it a competitive process where you select the best project overall. And this would be an alternative set of regulations where you're not repealing the existing regulations, you're providing an alternative path so that you can avoid issues of vesting and do this through a development agreement rather than through a conventional permit process. And so we set out to essentially figure out what are all the barriers to development and how can we remove as many of those as possible while still getting a quality project. And so part of this is going to be hugely reliant on the design standards, which are under development. And I know Councilmember Diener and Ashby have both attended some of those meetings, and we're planning on, we're handing out the draft of that to the Planning Commission tonight. They're going to be we're going to be giving them a presentation at their next meeting in December, and then hopefully have a public hearing on that in January to move that forward. And so this mixed-use pilot program is very dependent on us also adopting design standards. And if for some reason we didn't adopt design standards, I would recommend if we approve the mixed-use pilot program, is delaying this by changing the date. If in March we realize we haven't completed the design standards, we should put this off by another month.
Because it says that in here. But I think my question was not the concept, because I'm very supportive of the concept. I think it meets our needs and provides, as Nick said, an avenue for us to perhaps get some redevelopment downtown. My question was more in terms of, how did we pick the particular sites that we did?
Yeah.
And did we have conversations with those property owners so that they know that their properties are involved in this?
So one of the part of what we did after we went on the field trip and we saw Burien and Bothell, I think specifically, where their historic downtown buildings were largely left intact, and they were building sort of adjacent or tangentially to their existing downtowns. It seemed to me that made a lot of sense as a place to start, because you really don't want to disrupt what's already happening in your downtown. You want to add to it, and then if the market exists for either of those buildings to be fixed up or replaced at some point in the future, that can happen. But it seemed like we wanted to leave our core 2 blocks of downtown alone. So we really set out to look at what parcels have a sufficient area to build a project that would have at least 10 units, which is the threshold in here, and I think it's a 5,000 square foot footprint. And then the other issue was that the attorney wanted to make sure that we weren't spot zoning, that there were a sufficient number of properties included, that this was really an area-wide thing. And so we looked at the East Gateway, the West Gateway, and then the areas immediately adjacent to our core in the central DOD downtown for redevelopment. And then we also looked at a lot of the height maps, and we tried not to include sites that either, or we looked at topo maps. We didn't want to block existing residential views. We tried to avoid sensitive areas, so steep slopes where, there are some areas that have slopes in here that any project would require a significant wall, but there are others that we left out, and I think between the Old West Schwab and Seattle, that hill is very steep. There's already some condos up there.
Right.
It didn't make sense to include those properties, and then we left the Ford dealership property out just because there's already a permit to redevelop that site. So that's sort of how we came to the map that we have. Does that answer your question? Well,
It does. Did we have conversations with the property owners so that they know that?
Some of them.
Some of them?
Yeah, some of the property owners we know and we have relationships with because they come into our office all the time. Others, we have no idea who this is, or it's an LLC.
Like that strip mall right
This
there.
is an LLC. I have no idea where they are or how to get a hold of them. But certainly, we think it's a good site for redevelopment if they're approached by somebody who's aware of this program.
Okay.
I actually have a meeting this afternoon. There's a new owner of Bayside Plaza who just bought that like a year ago, and he found out about this and is excited about it and wants to come in and talk to me. So I think the word has gotten out. We've talked to at least 4 or 5 different owners.
Will we mail this to LLCs?
After it's adopted, I would be happy to send it out and let people know that we've done this. But yeah, I think the public noticing standard, we did not do any kind of mailing for this because
Right.
it's a legislative, even though there's a map associated with it, it's more of a legislative type process. So I think the other key, and I'll go back to the MUPP, the MUP zone map.
What's the height differences between like 2, 3, 4, 5?
So a 1 is, so first of all, 1, 2, 3, and 4 have a height limit and a number of stories limit. And so because we're taking the average grade, a site that has a lot of variation could potentially result in a 10-story building rather than a 5-story building if that's what's allowed. So the MUPP 1 is 37 feet, not to exceed 3 stories. And so that's a generous first floor height for a commercial space, and 2 10-foot floors above that.
And like 2 up there, you've got, is that the hotel?
Correct.
Which is currently 3 stories, right? Is it 2 or 3?
It's only 2.
Which, can you, because I can't read, and I couldn't read the map, which one is 1s, 2s, and 3s, if you could designate that for me.
So the 1s, you know what?
There's no 1s.
Yeah, we got rid of all the 1s. That didn't even occur to me. Anyway, we had some 1s on here, but we decided to take everything to a 2. So you've got 2s mostly along the waterfront on the north side of Bay Street, which is where we currently have 27 feet permitted outright, and then you can get 39 with a conditional use permit. It'll now be 48 feet, not to exceed 4 stories. And so that's more generous than what we have now, but not by a whole lot in terms of the maximum building height. I think it's a 9-foot difference. The 3s...
And that's allowed within the shoreline master plan.
Well, you still have to get a shoreline permit if you're in the shoreline area, and height does come into play if there are residential views that are affected by a project. And so it's possible that those get limited to 35 feet, but it really depends on what happens in a public hearing.
Okay.
So the 3s are mostly, there's a couple of 2s also going up Klein here, with 3s below. The slope kind of cuts across here, and we wanted 3s on the lower part of the hill and 2s on the upper part of the hill so as not to block views.
58 feet.
Okay.
And then you've got 3s on the south side of Bay Street through all of downtown until you get over to Blackjack Creek, which again is a shoreline area. And but then we go to a 4 at that empty shopping center at along Bethel there, where next to Kentucky Fried Chicken. And then there's also a 4 on the uphill side of Bethel. This site actually is one of those that has a lot of grade change between the lower elevation and the upper elevation. It's like probably 70 feet of change.
Nasty hill.
Yeah. And then the mixed use 5 is again a Perry and Bay Street over here. And I think actually the Perry and Bay Street area had been the mixed use 1, and we created a 5 because we thought that there were 1s elsewhere on the map, but I think those were the only ones.
So will you delete this NEPP 1 since...
Or make
Or
5
make it-
1.
Yeah, I think we need to make 5 1
There you go.
probably, but that's a good catch. So anyway, the other part of this is that we've got a lot of goals in our comp plan that support providing food, access to food, and the fact that there isn't a grocery store downtown. We decided that creating a bonus for a grocery store downtown would be a very good thing to do, and what we're offering is an extra 10 feet of height for any project, but that height bonus is limited to 20,000 square feet if you provide a 10,000 square foot grocery store, which the average Trader Joe's is, I think, 12,000 square feet. So we're not talking about a superstore.
Harbor Greens.
But yeah, something that would serve the community and the residents who are going to be moving downtown as part of this program. And because the program also has a lesser parking requirement than what we currently have adopted, we felt that getting people access to food where they can walk to food is an important component of this. Otherwise, you're not getting rid of the need for a car because people have to drive up to Safeway or Fred Meyer or wherever it is that they're doing their shopping.
Will we get any pushback from building owners on a property tax basis? When will they be revalued?
Well, you're revalued unless you apply for abatement. You're revalued immediately.
Okay.
You can, if you're a mixed-use project, you can get abatement if you provide the affordable units in accordance with our
Correct.
our code, which actually I don't remember. There's an 8-year and a 12-year abatement. One of them has a lot of affordable units. The other one, I think it's just multifamily construction. You can get the abatement. And so they have to apply for that, but they would be eligible to get that on the residential portion of the
If
project.
they choose to redevelop.
Yeah. The other part of the map that's important is, first of all, the ferry terminal and the pedestrian path are shown on here. We are requiring that any project in here have ADA compliant pedestrian access to the pedestrian path or the ferry terminal. And so basically, anybody who wants to build a project is going to have to extend sidewalks to the pedestrian path so that we can justify people being able to get to an employment center and get to Seattle without a car. That's easier at some sites than it will be for others. I was looking in advance of our meeting today with Bayside Plaza. There's no sidewalks over here on DeKalb across the front of Dick Valist. Some of the sidewalks are in, but some of them aren't. There's a mid-block crossing here, which is not to an ADA standard. So that project would probably be extending 400 or 500 feet of sidewalk in order to meet the requirements of the mixed-use pilot program, but that would provide me continuous accessible access to the pedestrian path. And I think I determined that it would have to get down to the corner of 7-Eleven, basically, is where there's an existing sidewalk. There's just some gaps, and that was the last non-ADA
No,
sidewalk.
not really. If you go across at get down there.
Mouse does not work on top of paper very well. So this sidewalk here,
Correct. But
This
if you go across, go back the other way. Okay, because that's where you're talking about at the end of those tow trucks. You're talking about where Holland Brothers is.
Yeah.
Okay, if you go across right there
That's
and
on
you
this-
get on that sidewalk,
yeah,
okay, right there, you can go up and you catch the path behind Kitsap Bank.
you can, except that the sidewalk ends here and is just a long
Right,
driveway.
that's the only, right through there.
So that's a gap. There's an ADA ramp on one side here, but not the other. But even then, once you get around the corner here, I think.
Right, but what I'm saying is you go to the water right there.
Yeah, you can go to the water here. This ramp is also.
Okay, but if you go across right there, you behind
Go back.
that restroom is
Yeah, that's the path. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's the point that I knew that they would need to get to. It's just a matter
Right.
of making sure that there's continuous access there in the form of ADA crosswalks and or sidewalks.
Because
So it's really this is the big gap.
that's the area, correct?
And it looks so much cleaner too.
Right.
Sidewalk.
No, exactly. And if the sidewalk went around that property and got to the boat ramp, but that's another.
So back to the MUP map here, the areas that are in red. So we've tried to make sure that there's a mix, that these are true mixed-use buildings where you do have some ground floor commercial space. Any space that fronts on one of these red streets has to have at least the first 40 feet of depth of the ground floor of the building as commercial. It does allow for parking garage accesses to interrupt that area, but if it's not on, if it's the Cheers where it's more of a marine type property, we're less restrictive about the ground floor uses. Also up here on Klein and Dwight, it's not as critical. The Comfort Inn again and the Marley apartment are also very limited in terms of what you can do there because they don't have room for parking unless it's between the street and the water. So we've excluded those from the storefront area. But that's really, we talk about storefront designations in our design guidelines, and those are slightly different than the storefront designations in this program, which is really all about the use of the ground floor of a proposed building. So, and then because of the grade change up here on Bethel, we wanted to clearly indicate that one side of the street is part of the storefront, the other side is not, because this site has such grade challenges in terms of, I don't think you could build storefronts along that steep embankment. Most of the development there is probably going to be up. You're going to have an entrance where you're going to have to hike up a little bit to get to the any kind of development, and so we didn't feel like that was a good site for that requirement. Oops. Oh man. There we go. Parking. So, consistent with our existing downtown regulations, we don't require parking for the ground floor uses in the central DOD. We've actually not required it for any of the ground floor uses in this area if it's a mixed-use building. We do require 0.5 spaces per dwelling unit, which is a very aggressive parking standard, I would say. I think Bothell, when we met with them, they said that they went with 0.5 in their new center, and they probably should have gone with 0.75 because it maybe wasn't enough. I think in this case, I think the developers that are going to come in are going to understand that their ability to rent units is going to be dependent on their parking, and so I'm comfortable going with a 0.5 standard because I think that the market is going to sort of dictate, and their performance is going to dictate what their parking needs are in order to be able to rent units. I think in most cases, they're going to provide parking probably around one space per unit, but I didn't want to force that because, first of all, we're allowing parking to be either on-site or off-site, where they can secure property in the vicinity of a project so that you get a more attractive building rather than a building that is half parking garage. And then the other thing is that if you meet 0.5 within the proximity of the existing building, you can still provide parking for your residents somewhere else. And so it doesn't, it doesn't necessarily have to be within 1,000 feet. I think that there's also other opportunities for parking sharing agreements, and also the Chamber of Commerce did a parking study. I think they said we have 1,000 parking stalls in the vicinity of downtown. That includes parking lots, commercial, privately held parking areas, but it seems to me that that's not fully being utilized on a daily basis. And so this will add a little bit of pressure to our parking situation, but again, I think the developer is going to provide the right amount of parking for their project, regardless of whether we have a standard or not. Landscaping, the only rule is that the entire site either has to be developed with a building or hardscape. It has to be landscaped, in terms of a planting plan. It has to be restored to some sort of natural condition. You pretty much the only thing you can't do is let the blackberries remain. So it's we allow 100% site coverage, and so there's not necessarily any landscaping required on site. It's only if you choose not to develop the whole site that you have to do any type of landscaping. So it's very flexible. If you're going to have any kind of public plaza, we do ask that there be landscaping covering at least 10% of any public plaza, just to make it not quite as barren. But I think I don't know that anybody would not provide at least some minimal level of landscaping like that. And then everything has to be irrigated as well. The last thing I wanted to touch on is the balconies. We have very narrow right-of-ways downtown. I think Bay Street is like 76 or 80 feet. I can't remember off the top of my head, but we do allow balconies to go into the right-of-way. However, under the development agreement, we're going to have to spell out exactly how that arrangement would work. The attorneys actually suggested that if we were going to allow a building permanently to have balconies that would be not, something that could be removed from the right-of-way, that we would actually want to vacate airspace rights within our right-of-way as part of any project. So, sometimes you see these false balconies where there's a railing and a sliding door, but actually no place to stand outside on the exterior of the building. It's possible we could see something like that. It's possible that people will set their buildings back or have them modulated in such a way that it creates an area for a balcony that's not projecting over the right-of-way, but that would be worked out as part of a development agreement. Awnings and canopies, however, are different. We would require that they be removable so that you can put them in the right-of-way under an agreement with the city, but if the city ever needed them moved, they could be taken off the building, and so it's not a permanent structural feature of the building encroaching into the right-of-way in the same way that a balcony would be. So that's...
And we would anticipate people would want balconies so that they could take advantage of the views.
Yeah, definitely.
Or maybe those common patio spaces like we saw over in Bremerton too.
Yeah.
Where it's,
Or you may forego balconies and do some kind of rooftop
That's it.
patio. Yeah. So
shared.
right now, the proposal is to allow up to 200 residential units under the program, except that the program can actually allow up to 250 if for instance, we've approved 175 units, we get a final project in that takes us to 200. We don't want to limit that project to 25 units. We want to give them, we want to make sure that that final project is viable. And so if they need to go over 200, they can. And so we've sort of arbitrarily set that at 250. These numbers can be shifted if you think we need more units downtown under this program. We could increase the program up to 250. If you think we need less, we could decrease it. I think it really depends on whether you want to trigger a competitive process. In the beginning of the ordinance, there's a point in time where we have this initial application window. And right now it's proposed that on April 2nd, this program opens. And we're going to take applications for the month of April. And at the end of April, if we have more applications than there is space, you trigger Section 15, which is a competitive selection process for the program. If you have fewer units, then we take all of them, and then the program stays open, and it's first come, first served for future applications. And then you don't trigger the competitive process. And so it's possible that you might get more competitive or attractive projects if they're competing with one another for the space. I don't think we're going to probably hit 200 on an initial application window. I suppose it's possible, but I'd be surprised if we had that many applications come in.
Do you have any sense as how many applications you may get? Or if you'll get any?
I think we'll get one for sure. I think 3 to 4 is possible. I don't see more than 4, barring the outcome of the meeting that I'm having this afternoon with somebody who found out about the program and wants to ask some questions about it. I think 3 to 4 would be a very positive outcome, and I'd be surprised if we get more than that. But you never know.
And that
I feel-
would be a Kickstarter though.
Yeah. I feel like raising our cap by 50, and I don't know why I feel that, but I would hate to feel like we've limited out at 250. Maybe 300 might be.
So have a number of 250 and up to 300
Yeah.
for that final application.
Yeah. And I don't know if that makes any sense at all, but
I think we can pose it to the Planning Commission
Yeah.
tonight and get their recommendation as well.
To me, it would boil down to size of units they're going to be able to make.
sure.
You know,
Or
and
how
the
many
qua-
submittals we get.
Right, and the quality. Yeah,
Thanks.
yeah. Because if somebody does the Bay Street, the Perry Avenue one, they may, that may, I don't know. I was
Yeah.
just trying to figure out how many dwelling units would go in each one. That, to me, has more opportunity for residential and less for storefront.
Yeah.
Well,
Well, for instance, the 640 Bay Street property is included, and that's that RFP that we've written as the next item up for discussion. We've done some analysis on that site, and we think that 36 to 40 units is probably the limit, and that's a fairly small site in the context of all the areas being designated under this program. So I would say that would be on the smaller side of the projects, and I think probably most projects are going to be like 75 units. If you had West Bay redevelop, it may even be 125 in multiple buildings. So it really depends on
Where
on
would
which
you-
sites develop.
Yeah, where would you envision the grocery store going?
I think that the site here that allows
Behind Kentucky Fried Chicken?
behind Kentucky Fried Chicken. First of all, I think it's got it's good access. It's on the state highway, and it's in that hole where the 10 additional feet of height is not going to block
Affect
anybody's
anyone.
views.
Yes.
Got decent parking there too.
I mean, I could see it at West Bay as well. I think
Well,
probably.
that's what West Bay was when it started.
Yeah, I think probably one of the those sites down at the intersection of
Yeah.
Bay Street and Bethel is likely where it would go. I suppose this area, if all we had a proposal for a 5-story building here. I think before the recession.
It was ugly.
Yeah, I
It
could
was
see.
maybe the ugliest building you've ever imagined.
I could see something there. Although in a site like that, you have difficulty with access for unloading and loading trucks. They're going to be parked out in the center of Bay Street, pushing
Right.
carts across the street. So yeah, I think it's probably one of the two sites down
Down
on
in
this
that
end
area.
that would
Yeah.
facilitate that the best.
That Les Schwab area, and up to that whole area there. Would that be reasonable, or what's going to happen to Titus's? Is he going to retain his section of that?
I would imagine. We haven't seen any proposals to change anything on that side of the street yet, so
Okay.
I have a feeling that as long as the Ford dealer is down there, that area across the street is going to be used for some sort of automotive use. I mean, it's included in this program, but I think that's probably the least likely
To redevelop.
area of redevelopment.
Okay.
Is there any truth to the rumor that that's a brownfield site?
Les Schwab?
Yeah.
I've heard that rumor too. I don't know if it's true, but yeah, I think that's probably an issue.
I've heard that's what has prevented
It's a
Ford
what
from
site?
acquiring brownfield stuff.
Contamination.
Oh, okay.
So I guess I know Sean, you've got to get out of here at about 8:30. So moving on to the 640 Bay Street proposal, really there's three moving pieces that have to kind of, they're separate actions, but they're moving forward together. Actually, I guess it's four. And we've talked about, when we acquired 640 Bay Street, we put it in our comprehensive plan as a site acquired for future economic development. In order to sell it, first of all, we would have to surplus it. The proposal at this point would be to have a competitive process to actually find a developer to build on that site, rather than just selling it to somebody who might put it in a land bank and hold it for 20 years. So the proposal would be to advertise soliciting proposals, looking to get our initial investment in the property back out of it, but having a competitive process where people could submit proposals to redevelop that site and presumably use the mixed-use pilot program for that redevelopment. So we've taken a stab at an RFP. Ultimately, I don't know that the council necessarily has to approve the RFP. I think it's really up to the council on whether you want to be that involved in the solicitation for proposals, or if you just want to surplus it and leave it up to the mayor to take the lead on that. But this is what we've drafted thus far, and we wanted to run it by this committee to see what you thought ought to be the next step. As it's written right now, I mean, we would actually propose going out for this in November in order to meet the timeline in the mixed-use pilot program ordinance, because we feel that in order to select a winning proposal and give them time to submit by that April deadline, we would really need to get this thing out probably before Thanksgiving, and then select the winning project in January, so that they can get to work on that proposal and still have 2 or 3 months to get it together. If we want to wait on this a little longer, I would propose pushing the mixed-use pilot program back a couple of weeks or months until this selection can take place. All of this is going to be dependent also on the design guidelines being adopted, because we don't want the mixed-use pilot program going live without design guidelines in place. And presumably, anybody who's developing this site is also going to want to see those final design guidelines before they start working on their they don't need the design guidelines for their competitive submittal. They really need it for their submittal under the mixed use pilot program. And so as it is now, I was proposing to bring this forward as a surplus item for the next council meeting, which means it isn't going to work study because there isn't a work study meeting before our next meeting. And that would also require the mixed use pilot program to be adopted at that next meeting as well. And so if that's too aggressive, I think we need to push the timeline on the mixed use pilot program back a month and then take this to work study in November. If this committee and the rest of council feels comfortable going forward with it, then we can stick to the schedule that's currently written in here.
I'm comfortable going forward with it, with the proposed schedule. I think that you might want to reach out to Cindy, talk to her. I don't think likes to be surprised by.
Right, and what I was going to say is we could take it to economic development. The packet would already be out, but we could have a thorough discussion at economic development, which would be the day before the council meeting. But
Now you're getting into a 2-committee issue.
well, right, but what happens in all of that is you've eliminated Councilman Lucarelli from the process. So if we could invite her to economic development and notice that meeting, that may take care of that issue. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Why don't we...
I'll check with Brandy.
well, let's talk to the mayor, and then maybe the mayor can reach out to her and see which she would prefer, whether it would be a one-on-one briefing or potentially noticing that as a public meeting.
Right, because that way we would get the other 2 council members. I mean, there would be... Well, John
So I thought
hasn't
there was-
been part of this.
Right. I thought there was pushback on 2 subcommittee reviews of the projects.
My take on that was simply that,
But nobody knew about it.
well, when you had John sitting here, because I'm just an alternate today, 3 council members, and then if we took it to economic development, 3 council members had it. And there was 1 council member that was not involved, and I thought that was the issue. So if we could include, if we could capture all 7,
I'm okay with that.
Yeah, let us reach out to Councilmember Lucarelli and...
And maybe John at that as well.
yeah.
Yeah, I
He's on
guess,
that.
because he's not... Yeah, we actually have 2 that
Well, yeah,
would be
if it's
involved.
publicly noticed,
Yeah.
publicly
Right.
noticed, he could show up as well.
Right.
Yeah.
My concern on if we're not able to make that work, then I think we would need a work study, because I do believe that this is a big enough element to our economic development and the revitalization. I think this is a big deal, and all council should be part of that.
Yeah. And
I like the momentum. Is there, if we feel like the momentum's going to slip, could we precede a regular meeting with a work study?
Yeah.
A half hour?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, I have to run that by the clerk and the mayor, but I think there is a noticing requirement that we have to meet, and we probably still have time for that.
I think so.
I will note on here, the mayor had a couple of comments, and I realized that I made his changes, but the copy you got was the old version. We are no longer going to ask under the RFP for a pro forma or a market study.
Oh, okay.
He felt like that was asking for sort of proprietary, things that people would want to hold close to their chest and may deter people from
Right.
coming in with a proposal if they're making public their market research. So we've sort of removed that from the proposal.
Okay.
We've also, I think we've cleaned up. We have some references in here to any project being required to comply with design guidelines, and because those haven't been adopted yet, we've changed the wording of that to let people know that this is in the works, and that a copy is available. I think those are the only 2 revisions that he had. But in any event, like I said, I think that the council would need to surplus the property, and you could simply make a motion for the mayor to go out with an RFP, or you could approve a specific RFP. It really depends on how much you want to manage the process for offering this property publicly. But were there any questions about the proposal? It's pretty simple.
No.
proposal. We're providing opportunities for people to meet with us in advance of the submittal deadline. And then we've listed the criteria that we're going to use for approving things, but it's really going to be up to the applicant to demonstrate that they have a good project. And honestly, we may get 1 or 2 proposals under this. I would not expect. I mean, I'd be surprised if we had more than 1, but you never know. We'll certainly put it in the paper and get it out there. But I think that with such new regulations and without any evidence that this type of development can work in Port Orford because we don't have any examples, I think that there's not many developers who are going to come over here and try to do something like this. And plus, the contractors are so in demand in Seattle that the people that are capable of doing this sort of project, I don't think there's enough builders over here to do this sort of thing. There's a handful of people that can do this, and most of them are very busy with other projects.
I read it right. When do they have, if someone does submit for the 640 Bay Street, what's their timeline to move dirt?
So right now, to move dirt, it would be in the development agreement or the contract. We would specify that sort of thing. I think on the back page there was a city contracting requirement section, and so I was providing the attorney an opportunity if we wanted to have any, or this committee an opportunity if we wanted to set any firm deadlines like. You must be under construction or have applied for permits by these dates. We could include those sorts of things. I think any requirements like that we add to the process is probably going to make it harder to find somebody to develop the site. But I think we absolutely do want to set some milestones. And for instance, maybe we don't close until they've applied for building permits. So there's still a risk that somebody ends up holding this thing and not developing it. Right. I don't think we'd want an agreement where the property reverts back to the city in the event somebody doesn't develop. But if they've gone so far as to prepare drawings and pay plan review fees, I think they're showing a pretty good faith effort to make something happen here.
And that was my concern, is we don't want them to enter an agreement and then hold it start for 6-7 years.
So
I agree. And so in that event, wouldn't we have a reversion clause?
You could. I mean, it's I don't know. I don't know whether that's going to deter somebody from going after a project here. Presumably, they're going to have to put down some valuable consideration, earnest money or something that they would risk losing.
I think it said.
Yeah, it said 10%.
Of something.
But if you put that end date so far out that nobody is threatened by that in terms of their project, I think that's reasonable.
Well, and the mixed-use pilot program has a built-in end date because the regulations allowing the project to go forward go away. Mm-hmm. So we could tie it to the... I think what we'd want to say is must apply under the mixed-use pilot program by April 30th. My pen is not working. And then I think the mixed-use pilot program expires. Well, then they must have a development agreement under the mixed-use pilot program by, I don't know, the end of 2018. But you get into a tricky situation because if we're saying that they have to have a development agreement, which is something that the city council approves, yet they're potentially losing their money if they don't get a development agreement, the city's in a position where you could just, if you decide you don't like the project, you could take their earnest money by not approving the development agreement. So we get into so
there's a bit of a good faith effort that has to be demonstrated.
Yeah.
I bet you the attorney can figure that out.
Yeah, I think we'll set some milestones, but I don't want there to be a conflict between the city council and acting against the interest of the developer, the way that it is structured.
Well, but I think we have the definition under the mixed-use program and the design standards
Yeah.
you know, and they meet those criteria, then maybe there's language that it can't be unreasonably withheld or something.
Yeah. I think maybe just skipping the development agreement and must apply for building permits by maybe like June of, maybe March of 2019, because that would give them the potential to start construction in the summer of 2019.
We have our tax abatement program to help with financing, or I mean, as a financial incentive. Is there any other financial piece that we could put together that would maybe spur some of the development?
The only thing that I can think of that you could potentially do was, well, first of all, because these are transit-oriented mixed-use projects, I think their traffic report is going to show trip generation that is less than a standard apartment. So their traffic impact fee is going to be less than an apartment that would be built out at Sydney and Sedgwick. But the other thing you could do is you could exclude them from, you could amend your traffic impact fee zone so that downtown is excluded because it's not
Because it's designed.
it's not
for
sending
pedestrian.
traffic out to the areas
Right.
that need traffic or that need transportation improvements in the same way that people are coming into downtown from those other areas. But, I think that we're strapped enough as it is for transportation funding. I don't know if we want to cut into...
One of the things that we had looked, that Kathleen Wilson had mentioned was that incremental tax. And to me that was, first of all, there would be a lot of administrative stuff to put it in order. And I don't know, and it seemed to me to be in competition with our tax abatement. You could do one or the other.
I didn't think it was allowable under our state.
It's Washington law does not provide
Tax
for,
increment financing.
not in the same way that other states do.
Okay, it does, I think, for the city, if the city provided the infrastructure, but I'm not sure what infrastructure.
It's very limited. It's not used in the same way that it is
Right.
used elsewhere. I think the other thing that you could potentially do is if you have somebody interested in the project, if sidewalks are needed from their project, like from Bayside Plaza to downtown, the city can throw $200,000 and do a public project in support of a private project rather than making the developer make those improvements. So that would be one way to potentially facilitate this, but that's a direct appropriation.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure that was something we had talked about.
Yeah. So I think we've got about 11 minutes here to talk about.
Just want to ask where you're going to advertise these, or maybe I don't
Probably
even
put in
know,
the
but-
Daily Journal of Commerce.
Okay.
But I'll ask around and
Yeah.
see if that's the best place or if there's a better.
Or some other places.
Yeah, we've
Are you
got.
talking about the Seattle Daily Journal?
Well, there's the Puget Sound Business Journal,
There's the
I think, and then
Puget
there's
Sound
the
and
Daily
Seattle.
Journal of Commerce in Seattle, which is
Right.
where you go out for a lot of RFPs for
Right.
road construction projects and or like design projects.
Okay.
So the banner signs. We have our latest iteration of the banner sign ordinance, and this was going to be on the agenda. I think it was pulled off the agenda in October because I think, Scott, you wanted to be there for the
Yes.
discussion. We were going to put it on the meeting for the 14th, but we have so much on the agenda, the mayor asked to push it off to the 28th. So I just wanted to take the opportunity to see whether this committee thinks that we've generally hit the mark or
I think-
whether we still have work to do.
I think you have generally hit the mark.
So it does now include a prohibition on feather signs along southeast and southwest Sedgwick, Tremont and Tremont Street West, southeast Lund, southwest Bay Street, and Bay Street. And so that's most of our east-west arterials with the exception of Mile Hill, which is not on the list. So I think that in itself is going to cut down on the number of these enormously, but it's still going to allow somebody like the Homemade Cafe to have theirs because they're on more of a side street, but they're, we've limited the number significantly. So if you have more than one street frontage, you get 2. If you're one street frontage, you get 1.
Have you been out to McCormick Woods? And at the entrance of McCormick Woods, there are 4 poles with, I would call them banner signs, but they're, they've got a top and a bottom. I like them.
Yeah.
I want to make sure we're not eliminating
No,
those.
Those are not feather signs.
That falls into a different.
And those are not banner signs either. Those are pole signs?
Those are free. Those are not explicitly allowed either, but that's a totally different type of sign that we haven't discussed previously.
Okay.
So if you
Because
want
those are
to,
very attractive, and I could see if Mr. Titus was real upset that he couldn't have his feather signs, he could have a sign like that.
What are you talking about? Is it like something like this with a
yeah,
like that? Okay.
It is, but this is much shorter. It's
Yeah.
it's really classy. It's
Oh,
clean,
okay.
it's really clean looking.
Yeah.
So it's almost like a pole mounted or arm mounted.
it's usually mounted to a light standard.
Yeah.
Yeah, it can't flutter in the wind because it's framed on
It's
underneath
framed
as
on-
well. So
Yeah.
it's not like it's not free moving.
What is this?
I mean, usually when those are put on,
It's a small steel pole, probably
Okay.
an inch and a half.
yeah, usually when those are put up, they're in the right of way and they're like street holiday type things, and those are allowed because they're city signs. When those are private, we would need to create some sort of language to allow that. But that's not something we've discussed, but we could certainly put it on the to-do list.
I wouldn't put it real high on the to-do list.
Okay. Good. Got a lot to do.
Not until we see a bunch of them everywhere.
Okay. So this will go forward then straight to council on the 28th.
Okay.
No work study.
I think we talked about bringing it straight to.
I think work study
We
might
had-
be full already as well.
Okay.
Also, the Sounders
I think
playoff
that's
game is
pretty
that
good.
night.
It was
and I'm
time to.
There you
really
go.
hoping to go.
Okay.
Well, I'm
Good.
really hoping to be able to watch. So,
Great.
I think that's everything. So then on the 14th, I think this committee's recommendation is to bring forward the mixed-use pilot program with the correction for the mixed-use 1 zone. Then bring forward the proposal to go out for an RFP on the 640 Bay Street property. And then the other thing I was going to mention is that along with that, we're going to strike the 640 Bay Street property from the comp plan, because if we're going to surplus it, it shouldn't be something that we're acquiring on our plan, and that'll be one last tweak to the comp plan ordinance, which is also coming forward. And that way, our action to surplus will be consistent with the comp plan.
And again, I want to make sure that that meets with all council, because this is a big enough thing, and if we can
Yeah.
get economic development to be a public meeting, then get that. And they can come or not come, but they would have had an opportunity.
Yeah.
I will get the minutes from this meeting out as quickly as possible too, so at least Cindy and others can
Yeah,
look.
we'll
see
reach out to
this.
them directly, and I think the fact that John and Cindy both are going to miss out on this, it may be we may meet with those two one-on-one, or invite them to the
Yeah,
the
whatever works,
committee meeting.
just so that we're inclusive.
All right.
Sounds good.